The sun shone through the grand windows of Mr. Hendricks's mansion, casting a golden light on the luxurious furniture and priceless art that adorned his home. It was another day of wealth, power, and prestige for Mr. Hendricks, a man who had built an empire with his own two hands and prided himself on his success. But that morning, something disrupted his sense of control. An expensive watch, a family heirloom worth more than some people earned in a year, had gone missing from his study. Panic surged through his veins, not because of the watch's value, but because of what it represented, his legacy. After a brief, frantic search, he called for the household staff to gather in the grand living room. His cold, sharp eyes scanned the faces of the maids, the butler, and the gardener as they stood nervously, hands clasped and heads bowed. As the tension in the room thickened, his gaze finally settled on Maria, a maid who had worked for him for years. She had always been quiet, dependable, and never caused any trouble. But in that moment, all Mr. Hendricks saw was her modest background, a woman of humble means, someone who could easily be tempted by the sight of such wealth. "Maria," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "I want to speak to you. Now." Maria stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea why he had singled her out, but the intensity in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. The other staff members exchanged nervous glances, but said nothing, too afraid to intervene. Mr. Hendricks wasted no time in getting to the point. "My watch is missing," he said, glaring at her as though she had already been convicted of a crime. "You were in my study yesterday. Do you have any idea where it might be?" Maria's eyes widened in shock. "Sir, I swear I didn't take anything," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I would never steal from you. I've always respected you and your home." But her words fell on deaf ears. To Mr. Hendricks, her defense sounded like nothing more than the desperate lies of someone trying to cover up their wrongdoing. His anger flared, his temper boiling over as he crossed the room and stood in front of her, towering over her small frame. "Do you think I'm a fool?" he snapped. "You're the only one who had access to my study. You've worked here for years, and I've trusted you with my possessions. But now I see that was a mistake. I should have known better than to trust someone like you." The words cut deep. Maria felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down, refusing to cry in front of him. She had worked for Mr. Hendricks for years, always doing her job with care and diligence. She had never imagined he would turn on her like this. She knew she hadn't taken the watch, but the more she tried to defend herself, the angrier he became. "Please, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't do it. I would never betray your trust. Enough!" Mr. Hendricks bellowed, his voice echoing through the grand room. "I don't want to hear any more lies. You're fired. Pack your things and leave my house immediately." The other staff members stood frozen, their faces pale and fearful. None of them dared to speak up, knowing that doing so could cost them their own jobs. Maria stood there, stunned, as the weight of his words sank in. She had lost her job, her livelihood, and all because of an accusation she couldn't disprove. With tears threatening to spill from her eyes, Maria lowered her head and turned to leave the mansion that had been both her workplace and a source of stability for so long. As she reached the grand entrance, she paused and looked back at Mr. Hendricks. He was still standing there, arms crossed, his expression cold and unyielding. "One day, you'll realize that not everything is about money," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet dignity. "And when that day comes, I hope you'll understand what truly matters." Her words, simple yet profound, pierced the heavy silence of the room. Mr. Hendricks, though still enraged, felt a strange chill run down his spine. Something about the way Maria spoke, calm, steady and certain, made him pause for a brief moment. But his pride wouldn't allow him to reconsider. Not yet. Maria walked out of the mansion, leaving behind a life she had built through hard work and dedication. Her heart was heavy with the injustice of it all, but she knew she had no choice but to move forward. As she stepped out onto the street, she clutched her belongings tightly, wondering how she would survive now that her only source of income was gone. Back inside, the tension in the mansion remained thick, but Mr. Hendricks tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling gnawing at him. He had fired her, done what he thought was necessary to protect his property and his reputation. Yet Maria's parting words lingered in his mind, echoing in the quiet halls of his mansion. Not everything is about money. It was a statement that made Mr. Hendricks feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: doubt. The days following Maria's departure passed slowly for Mr. Hendricks, like a weight pressing on his chest that refused to lift. At first, he tried to brush off the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in his gut, telling himself that he had done the right thing by firing her. After all, she had been in his study, and the expensive watch was missing. What other conclusion could he have drawn? He kept busy as he always did, throwing himself into meetings and business deals, surrounding himself with people who praised his success and admired his wealth. But even as he stood in front of clients in his immaculate suit, the nagging thought in the back of his mind refused to be silenced. What if I was wrong? It was during one of his lavish dinner parties that the doubt really began to set in. The mansion was filled with laughter and conversation, the clinking of champagne glasses echoing through the grand halls. Mr. Hendricks, surrounded by other elites, forced a smile as he listened to his business partners discuss their latest ventures, but his mind kept drifting. From across the room, he noticed the new maid quietly serving drinks. She was careful, diligent, and silent, much like Maria had been. But every time he glanced at her, he couldn't help but be reminded of Maria's expression on the day he had fired her. The sadness in her eyes, the way she had spoken those last words to him, haunted him. One day, you'll realize that not everything is about money. He tried to shake it off, turning his attention back to the conversation at hand, but the words stuck to him like glue. As the night wore on, he found himself retreating to his study, where the missing watch had once sat on his desk, a symbol of his wealth and status. He stared at the empty spot, where the timepiece should have been, and felt an odd hollowness inside. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if something was missing, something more important than the watch. Mr. Hendricks had always prided himself on his ability to remain in control, to keep everything and everyone in their proper place. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a crack in his carefully constructed world. Sitting in his large leather chair, he let out a frustrated sigh. "Why does this bother me so much?" he muttered to himself. He was a man who had built his fortune from the ground up, who had faced countless challenges in his career. Yet somehow, the simple words of a woman he had dismissed as beneath him were enough to unsettle him in ways he hadn't expected. He leaned back, closing his eyes, trying to push the thought away, but images of Maria's tear-filled eyes and trembling hands flooded his mind. No matter how much he told himself that she was guilty, that she had stolen from him, there was something inside him that whispered otherwise. The guilt began to gnaw at him. He had made the accusation so quickly, so decisively, without giving her the chance to truly explain herself. In his anger and frustration, he had dismissed her without a second thought. But now, as the days stretched on and he revisited that moment in his mind, he began to question his own actions. He had fired her not just because the watch was missing, but because he had assumed that someone from her background, someone poor and struggling, would naturally be tempted by the allure of wealth. It was easier to place the blame on her than to face the possibility that the fault might lie elsewhere. But what if Maria had been telling the truth? What if she had been innocent all along? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He imagined her, now without a job, struggling even more to support herself and her family. What if his hasty decision had ruined her life? He had the luxury of wealth to shield him from hardship. But Maria, she had nothing. The image of her leaving his mansion, her head held high but her heart clearly broken, played over and over in his mind. Her parting words, "Not everything is about money," took on a new meaning now. In that moment, Mr. Hendricks realized that he had judged her not based on her actions, but on her social standing. He had always believed that money could solve any problem, that it was the ultimate measure of success. But Maria's words forced him to confront a deeper truth, one he had avoided for years. Perhaps in his pursuit of wealth, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. He could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling inside him. He had wronged Maria, and for the first time in his life, Mr. Hendricks felt something he wasn't used to feeling: regret. That night, as he lay in his enormous bed, surrounded by the trappings of luxury, sleep eluded him. The soft rustle of the curtains in the cool night breeze, only seemed to amplify the silence in his heart. His thoughts kept returning to Maria and the injustice he had done to her. He couldn't escape the realization that he had been wrong, not just about her, but about many things. The next morning, Mr. Hendricks sat at his breakfast table, staring at the lavish spread before him: freshly baked croissants, imported jams, and gourmet coffee. But for the first time in his life, the wealth and abundance that surrounded him felt hollow. He pushed the plate away, unable to eat. Something had to be done. He couldn't continue living like this with the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He needed to make things right. But how? Could he even begin to undo the damage he had caused? With a deep breath, Mr. Hendricks resolved to find Maria. He didn't know how she would react, or if she would even be willing to listen to him. But he knew one thing for certain: he owed her an apology. He had to confront the guilt that had been eating away at him before it consumed him entirely. Mr. Hendricks couldn't shake the guilt that had settled in his heart, the heavy weight that seemed to cloud everything he did. He replayed the scene of firing Maria over and over in his mind: her tear-filled eyes, the sadness in her voice, and the quiet dignity with which she had left. Every time he thought of her words, "Not everything is about money," the pit in his stomach deepened. Determined to get to the bottom of the matter, Mr. Hendricks decided to investigate further. If there was even a chance that Maria hadn't stolen the watch, he needed to find out. He could no longer bear the thought of having wronged her so grievously, especially if her innocence was something he had carelessly overlooked. The next morning, after a restless night of fragmented sleep, Mr. Hendricks summoned the remaining staff to the parlor for a meeting. The housekeeper, gardeners, and new maid gathered, looking uneasy, their eyes darting around the lavish room. It wasn't often that Mr. Hendricks addressed the staff directly, especially not with such a serious tone. "I want to ask you all something," he began, pacing the length of the room, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. His posture was rigid, but there was an underlying tension in his voice that made everyone pay attention. "About the missing watch, Maria was accused, and I fired her. But I need to know, did any of you see or hear anything unusual before or after the watch went missing?" The staff exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to respond. Mr. Hendricks rarely invited questions or allowed discussions. The atmosphere in the room was thick with unease, the luxurious surroundings now seeming suffocating. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, the housekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Davies, cleared her throat and stepped forward. "Sir, I didn't see Maria take anything," she said hesitantly, wringing her hands together. "She's always been an honest worker, if I may say so. Never once in all her years here did I suspect her of any wrongdoing." The other staff members nodded in agreement, their faces filled with quiet sympathy for the woman who had been cast out so abruptly. Mr. Hendricks frowned, feeling the first prickles of doubt take root in his mind. Could it really have been a mistake? "What about the watch?" he pressed. "Has anyone seen it since? Could it have been misplaced?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as the staff shifted uncomfortably. It was the new maid, the one who had taken Maria's place, who finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I was cleaning your study yesterday, and I noticed something strange." Mr. Hendricks turned sharply toward her, his heart pounding. "Strange? What do you mean?" The young maid's eyes flickered nervously as she continued. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when I moved one of the drawers, I heard a noise. It sounded like something had fallen behind it." Mr. Hendricks felt a chill run down his spine. Could it be? Without waiting for another word, he strode out of the parlor and headed straight for his study, his pulse quickening with every step. The staff followed at a respectful distance, watching as their employer rushed toward the room where the accusations against Maria had begun. When he entered the study, Mr. Hendricks went directly to the desk where the watch had been kept. The room was silent, except for the faint sound of his breathing. He knelt down beside the heavy wooden desk and, with trembling hands, pulled the drawer out as far as it would go. There, wedged in the narrow gap behind the drawer, was the missing watch. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Mr. Hendricks stared at the gleaming timepiece in disbelief, his mind racing. It hadn't been stolen. It had simply fallen. The truth was so painfully obvious now, but he had been too blinded by his own arrogance and assumptions to see it. The watch had been there all along, waiting to be found, while Maria had been wrongfully accused, shamed, and cast out of the only job she had to support herself. Mr. Hendricks swallowed hard, the gravity of his mistake crashing down on him like a tidal wave. How could he have been so careless, so quick to judge? He had ruined her life, fired her without proof, without even giving her a chance to explain. His wealth, his power, had given him the belief that he could control everything. But in this moment, he realized how hollow those things truly were. He picked up the watch with shaking hands, feeling its cold weight, and stood in the empty study. The opulence that once gave him pride now felt suffocating, a reflection of his misplaced values. The grandeur of the mansion, the luxury of his life. It all seemed meaningless now, compared to the injustice he had inflicted on Maria. The words she had spoken came rushing back to him, clearer than ever before. Not everything is about money. In that moment, Mr. Hendricks understood. It wasn't just about the watch or the accusation. It was about how he had judged Maria based on her status, her job, her humble background. He had seen her as lesser because she worked as a maid, as if her worth was tied to her paycheck. But the truth was, Maria had more dignity and strength in her than he had ever shown. The shame burned through him like fire. He had allowed his wealth to blind him, to make him believe that money was the only thing that mattered, that it could solve every problem. But now, standing in his grand mansion, holding the watch that had caused so much pain, Mr. Hendricks felt more lost than ever. He needed to make amends. He had to find Maria, to tell her that she was right, that he had been wrong in every way that mattered. But how could he ever apologize for something so unforgivable? How could he face her after what he had done? As he stood there, clutching the watch, Mr. Hendricks made a vow to himself. He would do whatever it took to make things right. He couldn't undo the past, but he could at least try to make up for the hurt he had caused. He would find Maria, apologize, and offer her whatever help she needed. He had been wrong about so many things, but one thing was now painfully clear. True worth wasn't measured in wealth or power. It was measured in character, in how we treat others, regardless of their status. With renewed determination, Mr. Hendricks left the study, the watch still clutched tightly in his hand. He had a long road ahead of him, but he knew he couldn't rest until he made things right. Mr. Hendricks had never felt more out of place in his life. The bustling city streets looked foreign as he walked toward the address he had painstakingly tracked down, deep in a part of town he had rarely, if ever, ventured into. The further he moved from the luxurious heart of the city, the more his surroundings changed. The high-rise buildings and elegant boutiques gave way to dilapidated apartments, cracked sidewalks, and flickering streetlights. He had spent days agonizing over this moment, rehearsing what he would say, wondering how Maria would react. The guilt that had gnawed at him for weeks had grown into something unbearable, a constant presence that made his wealth and power feel utterly meaningless. It wasn't just about finding the watch or realizing his mistake. It was about coming face to face with the person he had wronged, the woman whose life he had shattered with his reckless accusations. As he approached the rundown apartment building where Maria lived, a wave of nerves washed over him. The building was old and in disrepair, its bricks chipped and its windows covered in grime. A small, broken buzzer box hung next to the door, and he could hear the faint sounds of life inside. Children playing, conversations drifting through the open windows. It was a world so far removed from the life he knew, a life of luxury and privilege, and it humbled him in a way nothing else ever had. Standing outside the building, Mr. Hendricks hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest, his palms sweaty despite the cool evening air. He had made a terrible mistake, but how could he ever make it right? How could he look Maria in the eye and apologize after the way he had treated her? But he knew he had no choice. He had to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how painful it might be. Taking a deep breath, Mr. Hendricks pushed the front door open and made his way up the narrow staircase. The hallways were dimly lit, the walls peeling with age, and the air smelled faintly of dampness. It was a stark contrast to the pristine marble floors and chandeliers of his own mansion, and with every step he took, he felt the weight of his privilege pressing down on him. At last, he reached Maria's apartment door. Apartment 4B. He stood there for a long moment, his hand hovering over the door, unsure if he had the courage to knock. What would she say? Would she even listen to him? And even if she did, would she be able to forgive him for what he had done? Summoning every ounce of bravery he had, Mr. Hendricks knocked lightly on the door. The sound echoed in the hallway and he held his breath, waiting. For a few agonizing moments there was no response. Then he heard footsteps approaching from the other side, followed by the sound of a lock turning. The door creaked open and there stood Maria. She looked different outside of her work uniform, wearing a simple blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her face showed signs of weariness, but her eyes were just as kind as he remembered. Despite everything, she still carried that quiet grace he had seen on the day she left his mansion. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, neither of them knowing what to say. "Mr. Hendricks?" Maria said at last, her voice filled with confusion. "What are you doing here?" Her question hung in the air, and Mr. Hendricks suddenly felt the full weight of his shame. How could he possibly explain? He had been so cruel to her, so quick to judge her, and now he was standing at her door like a beggar seeking forgiveness. I came to apologize," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "Maria, I was wrong. About everything." Maria's eyes widened in surprise. Of all the things she had expected, an apology from her former employer was not one of them. She remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I accused you of something you didn't do," Mr. Hendricks went on, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I found the watch. It wasn't stolen. It had just fallen behind the desk. I fired you without even giving you a chance to defend yourself, and I can't tell you how sorry I am for that." Maria's expression softened, but she still said nothing, waiting for him to finish. "I judged you," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I judged you because of where you come from, because of your job, and I never stopped to think about the person you really are. I let my arrogance blind me, and in doing so, I hurt you. I'm so sorry, Maria." For the first time since he had arrived, Maria looked away, her eyes downcast. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was calm but filled with quiet pain. "You hurt me deeply, Mr. Hendricks," she said, her words careful and measured. "I worked for you for years, and I thought you trusted me. But the moment something went wrong, you didn't even hesitate. You accused me without a second thought, as if my years of loyalty meant nothing." Mr. Hendricks swallowed hard, the guilt pressing down on him like a weight. He couldn't argue with her. She was right. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I needed to tell you that I was wrong, and I am so sorry." Maria was quiet for a long time, and Mr. Hendricks could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had prepared himself for her anger, for her rejection, but as the silence stretched on, he realized that her forgiveness was something he desperately wanted, something he needed, not just for her sake, but for his own. At last, Maria looked up at him again, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut him to his core. "Mr. Hendricks," she began softly, "life has been hard for me. I've had to deal with a lot of things that people like you will never have to face. But I've learned that holding on to anger only makes life harder. I don't expect kindness from everyone, but I refuse to let bitterness take hold of my heart." Her words were filled with grace, the kind of strength that comes from enduring hardship with dignity. Mr. Hendricks felt his throat tighten, and for the first time in a long while, he felt small, so much smaller than he had ever imagined possible. "I forgive you," Maria said, her voice quiet but steady. "Not because what you did was okay, but because I don't want to carry the weight of it anymore. We all make mistakes. It's what we do after them that matters." Tears pricked at Mr. Hendricks's eyes, and he blinked them back, overwhelmed by the depth of her forgiveness. He had come expecting to be turned away, to be met with anger or indifference, but instead, Maria had offered him something far greater than he deserved. I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Maria replied gently. "Just learn from this." And with that, the weight that had been crushing him for weeks seemed to lift. Just a little. He wasn't sure if he could ever truly make up for what he had done, but Maria's forgiveness gave him a glimmer of hope, a chance to be better, to change. As Mr. Hendricks stood there, humbled and grateful, he realized that Maria had taught him something far more valuable than any lesson he had learned in the world of business. She had shown him that true strength comes not from wealth or power, but from kindness, forgiveness, and the ability to see others for who they truly are. The days that followed Mr. Hendricks's apology were marked by an overwhelming sense of clarity. For the first time in his life, his wealth and power seemed irrelevant, mere distractions from what truly mattered. He had spent so long building a life of luxury, surrounding himself with expensive things, and believing that money could solve all his problems. But now, standing at the threshold of a new understanding, he realized that none of it had ever made him happy. It had simply given him control. That control, however, had blinded him to the worth of people like Maria. People whose strength came from enduring hardship with grace. People who lived with dignity in the face of adversity. And as he stood in his office, gazing out the window of his towering mansion, he felt a profound shift within himself. It wasn't enough to apologize. Words alone couldn't undo the damage he had caused. He needed to make amends to truly change the course of both their lives. The next morning, Mr. Hendricks wasted no time. He instructed his assistant to contact Maria, asking her to come to the mansion for a meeting. He understood that she might be hesitant, even suspicious, given how things had ended between them. But he hoped she would give him the chance to show that he was sincere in his desire to make things right. Maria, on the other hand, had spent the past few days in quiet reflection. She had forgiven Mr. Hendricks, but that didn't mean she had forgotten the sting of his accusation or the pain of losing her job without cause. Still, there was something about the way he had apologized that lingered with her. His remorse had been genuine, and while she was wary of being hurt again, she knew that accepting his apology had been the right thing to do. And now, as she received the invitation to meet with him, she felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. What more could he possibly want from her? When Maria arrived at the mansion, it was different this time. The house loomed just as grandly as before, but she didn't feel as small as she once had, standing before its enormous doors. Her head was held high, her heart steady. Mr. Hendricks had wronged her, but she had risen above it. She had nothing to prove to anyone but herself. The door opened, and the butler, who once regarded her as a mere maid, now greeted her with respect, ushering her inside with a polite nod. The change was subtle but meaningful. Maria walked through the familiar halls, feeling a strange sense of peace. No longer was she just the hired help in this world of opulence. She was someone who had faced hardship and come out the other side stronger. In the study, Mr. Hendricks waited, pacing nervously. He had prepared for this moment, but when Maria entered the room, all the words he had planned to say fled from his mind. Instead, what struck him was her quiet confidence, her poise. There was no bitterness in her eyes, only a calm resolve. It made him realize how far removed from her world he had been, how little he had understood about the strength it took to live as she did every day. "Thank you for coming, Maria," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. Maria sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "I wasn't sure what to expect, but I'm here. What is it you wanted to speak about?" Mr. Hendricks took a deep breath. "I wanted to talk to you about your job." Maria raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I wrongfully accused you," he began, his voice steady but filled with regret. "And I know that nothing I say can undo what I did. But I want to make it right. I want to offer you your job back, not as some act of charity, but because you are good at what you do, and you deserve to be treated with respect. More than that, I want to ensure that you're compensated fairly. I was blind before, but I see now how much you've given and how little you received in return." Maria's expression softened, but she still felt a flicker of hesitation. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Hendricks, but it's not just about the job. It's about trust." "I understand that," he said quickly, "which is why I don't just want to give you your job back. I want to offer you something more, something to help your family. I know how hard you've worked to support them, and I can't stand the thought of you struggling when I have the means to help. I'd like to set up a fund to help care for your mother and give you the stability you deserve." Maria blinked, her breath catching in her throat. This was not what she had expected. She had thought he might offer an apology, perhaps a return to her old position. But this was beyond anything she had anticipated. The idea of financial security for her family was something she had never dared to dream of. Yet even as the offer tempted her, a part of her resisted. "Mr. Hendricks," she said slowly, "I'm not looking for charity. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I don't want to feel like I'm being handed something out of pity." Mr. Hendricks shook his head. "This isn't pity, Maria. It's me finally understanding that not everything is about money. You've taught me that. I don't see this as charity. I see it as an acknowledgement of your worth. You've given so much, and I want to make sure you have the chance to live without fear, to provide for your family without struggling every day." Maria looked at him, her heart torn. The old Maria would have refused outright, unwilling to accept help from the man who had wronged her. But this was different. This was a man trying to right his wrongs, and she could see the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't offering this out of guilt. He was offering it because he had learned something important, something that had changed him. I don't know what to say," Maria admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't have to say anything right now," Mr. Hendricks replied. "Take your time. Think about it. I just want you to know that the offer stands whenever you're ready." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling between them. Then slowly, Maria nodded. "I'll think about it, and thank you for everything." The days that followed were filled with quiet contemplation for both of them. Maria, having accepted her position back at the mansion, returned to work. But things were different now. Mr. Hendricks treated her with a newfound respect, not just as an employee, but as a person whose worth he had finally come to understand. The other staff noticed the change as well. No longer was Mr. Hendricks the cold, aloof boss they had once known. He had become more considerate, more thoughtful in his interactions with everyone around him. For Maria, the decision to accept his help had been a difficult one, but as the weeks passed, she began to see the positive impact it had on her family. Her mother's health improved with better care, and for the first time in years, Maria felt a sense of security, a sense that she could breathe without the constant fear of losing everything. As Mr. Hendricks watched Maria continue to work with quiet determination, he realized that her parting words, the ones that had haunted him for so long, had been the catalyst for his transformation. Not everything is about money. It had taken him far too long to understand, but now those words were etched into his heart, guiding him toward a life of greater meaning. In the end, both Maria and Mr. Hendricks emerged from the ordeal with a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. They had both been humbled. Both learned the true value of kindness, humility, and respect. And while their lives had taken different paths, they would always carry with them the lessons of forgiveness, compassion, and the undeniable truth that wealth, in the absence of integrity, was worth nothing at all. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.